right, well, there's some height adjustments here. I was supposed to stand on Kelly Surtees' shoulders. But she recanted. So I'm just up here doing my thing on my own with some stand here. So can you hear me and now see me well enough? Thank you. Okay. Wait, let me try to get my notes situated without them falling all over the place. Okay. So if I were born on Mars, thinking about astrology beyond the big blue marble, how many of you get that reference? We're dating ourselves. Do you remember the show, The Big Blue Marble? Okay, there's a lot of people like, no. So let me also start off with an apology and an acknowledgement of the people here. I'm not going to read all their names because you can. But the apology is last year when I spoke during my keynote address, I didn't speak enough about the women astrologers who contributed so much to astrology. So I like to remediate that because I think men should do the work to remediate things with women. And I offended, and a colleague let me know that they were offended by that, and I heard them. And I think that's important to acknowledge when you're heard. So I will say, I don't know if she minds me identifying her. Patricia, I've heard you. Thank you for pointing that out. Let's keep doing that for each other. So I'm acknowledging the people here that you see here, but I also want to open up, start talking about the phrase that we use, as above, so below. So many of you know that that comes from the Emerald Tablet, and among the people that first translated were actually Muslims, Islamic astrology. And so I want to read for you first in Arabic the translation, and I got some help with it, and then give you the translation because it gives you a little more, and I think it's an interesting place to start as we dive deeper into understanding the idea of being on Mars. And it goes, Inna al-Allah min al-asfal wal al-asfal min al-Allah, which means, you can see that the Arabic is a little pithier, that which is above is from that which is below, and that which is below is from that which is above. That's the actual first translation of this. So let's start talking about as above. What does the planet of action, aggression, and energy become for us on Mars? What about Earth? Now, our days would be a little longer with Mars clocking in at about, it actually is about 40 minutes longer than our 24 hours. But it'd be a great way to cut your years almost in half. So on Mars, if you were 18, or I should say 36, you would become 18 in Martian years. So if you're concerned about your age, get to Mars. All our known planetary cycles would change and we would add one, Earth, which I'll talk more about. And our little blue marble of the world will become our home and a source of nurturing comfort, memory, and feeling, nearly all the things that we associate with our moon, since our satellite and planet would look almost indistinguishable from our eyesight from the red planet. So what I want to show you is, first, pay attention to this picture. This is a picture from the European Space Agencies, and this is taken July 3rd, 2003. And there's Earth that you see at the bottom, or to, I guess, your left. And then you see the moon. And here is the chart for that. Now, I do not have the time for when that picture was snapped, but a couple things I want you to pay attention to is that you do see the moon in the 12th house with this chart, with Jupiter, correct? Right. And so, and we see Mars in the 7th house as if that were the actual chart. But this is the heliocentric view, as if it were taken from Darmstadt, Germany, where actually the ESA is based for its missions. And one thing I want to point out, do you see what looks like a lot of fortune? I don't think I have a, well, I do have this cursor. You see this, which looks like a lot of fortune, but isn't? That's Earth. And you see right next to it is Mars. So if we were looking from a heliocentric point of view, that's what it would look like, and it actually matches that photo a little more. So we would have a whole different perspective on what it would mean and look like to be on Mars, on Earth. So this is my chart as if I were born on Mars. So I am a Scorpio, I have a Scorpio sun, my moon is in Leo, and I'm a Pisces rising. Now you might notice that you're Pisces rising still though. Well, these voices are just gonna come out. Those who know me know the voices just come, right? So the thing to know about that, well, because we're not doing it literally on Mars, and this is using a program, and I have to thank Adam Gainsberg for this, and it's not available because the actual maker of the program, he passed away. I think I'm going to say 2017, 2018, but some time ago. And the program is called Intrepid. And what it allows you to do, and what I'll point out again using the cursor here, is that you can imagine your chart. So I guess on Mars, I would become a Leo using the Martian zodiac. So the Sun, Mercury, and Jupiter are conjoined, which is not true in my chart, my natal chart here on Earth. My Mars is at 23 degrees Capricorn, but on Mars, look where Earth goes, in Cancer. So it'd be opposite to it. Just to give you some sense of what your chart might look like if you were on Mars. Again, we would change the ascendant and the midheaven because then that would be more related to the local horizon on Mars if we were doing it literally on Mars. Now, we get a couple new things that you may not recognize, although they look familiar. Over here, where you see in Pisces, that is the moon Deimos. Okay, so this is Deimos right here. Over here, down here, even though it's kind of obscured by the closed captions here, this is Phobos. We're going to talk a lot more about Phobos. Phobos is the largest moon on Mars or for Mars, so it's going to look a little different. So I just wanted to give you a sense, answering the question first off, like what would it look like to be on Mars? So I'm not going to read all of this, but I want to highlight a few things. Mars has two moons, as I mentioned, Phobos and Deimos. And there's some conjecture, at least from one particular astrologer whose name is Walter Pullen. And Phobos, he describes as more dealing with being more personal and specific as related to our ability to be assertive and stand up for ourselves, or even sometimes be aggressive. Deimos, he would say, is probably how dread compels us to find more determination. And what I also want to show you, if you can see it here, is that he has a whole breakdown of all the moons. And again, his name is Walter Pullen. It's on Astrolog. It's actually on this website here, what you see, astrolog.org. But you can see that Phobos, Deimos, we have Ganymede, Europa, all the different moons. And he describes this as Mars for Phobos and assertiveness and activity for Deimos. But as Tara said, I like to ask questions. So the question's like, where the hell did he get this? How did this come up? And I'm not clowning the astrologer or his work or the astrology, but I think it is a logical question to start thinking about when we are talking about going off-world. It brings up some of these questions that you see before you. Is first off, and I plan on answering some of these questions, and some of them are going to take a lot more time to answer. Is off-world settlement even just more speculative and worth our time as astrologers? What fascinating aspects or ideas could form the bedrock of our astrology on other worlds, both within and beyond our solar system? What can we understand as the basis of astrology on Earth? How do we approach and handle interstellar astronomy's reality, science, history, and ethics? That's also something that we're going to tackle. And besides new moons, planets, and even a new zodiac, I wondered this, are we going to have a fair distribution of, the zodiac? Are they mainly going to be the Aries, the fire signs? I'll go, I'm God. Or the air signs, and then the earth and water signs, you're just kind of like, yeah, fuck that, not going. Staying on this planet. And I think there's actually an interesting answer that might surprise you. But one of the things I want to get into as well is an idea from a book that I would recommend to read. I don't know if I agree with all the ideas that are articulated, but I think it is worth reading. And it is a book by John Michael Greer, The Twilight of Pluto, Astrology and the Rise and Fall of Planetary Influences. And just to make this a little more succinct than rather than reading the whole slide to you, his argument is that as we developed, as humanity developed we essentially developed by our discovery of each of the planets besides the sun and the moon. So we developed more toward craftsmanship and the arts in terms of like, okay, that's an ugly pot that you're getting the water in. Can you make it a little nicer? You know, can we have something a little better? And then we moved because we discovered Venus is first. Venus actually has high visibility. So it's believed that Venus was probably among the earliest planets, again, besides the sun and the moon that we discovered. And then perhaps we moved as we got more advanced, we actually realized and we became more of a settler community, you know, moving away from being more nomadic to more agricultural. We went toward wanting to protect ourselves and developing metal and other things that we can use, and then having more of a hierarchy related to priests and more in terms of government, and then Saturn. And you might say, like, well, Mercury was last. Mercury was last because remember, if you've studied some history, some prehistoric history, an idea, writing was among the last things to kind of develop. Not speech, right? But in terms of writing, in terms of making notations related to those things. So his idea is that as humanity advances, there's something that really happens. And I like to read what he actually says because I think I don't want any misrepresentation of his work. The discovery of a planet doesn't cause the energies expressed by that planet to come into play. Rather, it's the influences expressed by the planet that come into play, affecting astronomers and leading to the discovery of the planet soon after. This distinction is crucial to understanding his work. A planet's understanding, he believes, can be felt 30 years of Saturn's cycle before its discovery and 30 years after. So within a 60-year window, even when a planet is demoted like Pluto, or as Ceres was demoted in the 19th century. So some of you may know this, that we might acknowledge now Ceres as a dwarf planet, but it actually was recognized in the 19th century as a planet and then demoted as an asteroid and now promoted again as a dwarf planet. So let's get into the idea of the interstellar aspect of astrology. And I like to use as a framework the outer planets because they actually highlight a story in understanding how we might get to Mars and beyond. So we start off with one of the first planets discovered, and that's Uranus. So around the time that Uranus is discovered, there is something very critical, maybe a century before, not quite in the time frame that's given by Greer, that what happens is that, especially with Copernicus, who's featured here, is that the idea expressed by Aristotle and Ptolemy for centuries, that there were crystalline spheres that moved around the Earth, including for the sun, actually was wrong. And what's interesting is that Copernicus was on his deathbed and basically, you know, revealed his work to the world and was like, peace, deuces, I'm out now, because I don't want to live with this shit, because I know it's going to be the fit hitting the shan. But it changed the world. And well, it changed, let me be correct. It changed the European world, right? The Islamic world was like, this doesn't make sense anyway. But the European world was like, wait, are you taking down Ptolemy and Aristotle? And that's what Copernicus did. And that leads to the rise of humanism, as we understand it. It was a decentering of Earth and a larger cosmos. And rather than like seeming to free Earth in that sense of embracing the divine, it seemed to recenter Earth as more the center, even more than Aristotle and Ptolemy did. And what happened is that, and I like what Richard Tarnas says, that we come into more of a disenchanted world. And this goes from the European Renaissance all the way into the late 19th century. So I like to quote something that Tarnas says about moving away from classic ideas of the cosmos with a certain conception of divinity and who we were in it, to a world of purposeless objects and random processes, and that have served as a highly effective basis and justification for human self-aggrandizement and exploitation of a world seen as undeserving of moral concern. So we decenter Earth only to disregard it. And then moving on, not too long after we move into this 18th century, we have the discovery in the 17th century of the telescope, and we have new ways in which to see the world. And in 1781, William Herschel and his sister, Caroline, discovered not only the planet we call Uranus, but also heavenly bodies like comets. And Caroline did a lot of work to document that. And just to be clear, so Uranus was not named Uranus first off. It was named Georgium Sidus, and this is in a highly contestable Europe. And the French and other people are like, I'm not calling it that. After your King George, forget about it. So we didn't have Uranus for at least maybe almost 100 years after that as the name. It's widely believed by astrologers, including Greer, that Uranus signals shifts in technical and technological expertise and usurps the existing political and social order. So this is around the time in 1781 that we also see many changes in the world, including the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, all of these different revolutions in terms of usurping what was known as the divine order of kings and queens and all of these particular royals. And so there's a whole reorganization of society. Not only that, but we also see technological wonders and changes that happen at an unprecedented rate. One of the things that I remember not really getting well educated at the time in high school with the Industrial Revolution, even though that's covered, the Industrial Revolution was massive in what it did. What it did was allow fewer people to do more work without drawing up or eating up more of the resources. So for instance, to be able to kind of do the size of work for a manufacturer or a factory, you would have needed more like thousands of men or women to be able to do that work. And then you had to have the resources to feed them. Think about that, all the cattle, all the different housing, all those particular things. With machines and factories, we didn't need that much. So this put Europe at a whole different scale in its history than had ever existed for its history. And that becomes important in terms of the Uranus idea, how it pushes humans forward. So that takes us into Neptune. And Neptune is where we start getting more into a certain different vision of the world, our world. And it was almost like a reaction to the discovery of Uranus and all the things that came with Uranus in terms of the technological advances. So Neptune was discovered in 1846. Now, one thing I would encourage you to do, just for shits and giggles, because I think it's fascinating, I love history, is to look at the discovery of Neptune, because it's really Neptunian. No, it really is. Like, someone would say, like, I think you should look here. No, we're not doing that. I don't think it's there. And it was mainly disturbed on the perturbations of Uranus's orbit, and then astronomers thinking, and mathematicians as well, believing like, well, maybe there's something else that is there. And so Neptune was finally discovered after discovering those anomalies. But it also became an era where Europe was swept up with a romanticism called the Romantic Era that longed for simpler times, emphasizing more that subjectivity that we lost with the shift related to the decentering of the cosmos. Imagination, heroic efforts, nature, community, something other than the bottom line, which started to really creep up more in terms of European politics and economics, and a search for the sublime. Anyone who's really into that kind of history, Johann Wolfgang Goethe is more of a brilliant example of that particular sensibility. In terms of going into where we're going, then we have the advance of Romanticism and then science fiction. And from that, we started speculating, well, what does this technology mean for us in terms of humanity? And so we have the emergence of science fiction. Now, one thing I do want to qualify, there are examples of science fiction before 1818. And even going from the Islamic era, from the Chinese, we also have evidence or ideas of science fiction. But the person who's most credited with really kind of changing the game is Mary Shelley. And that comes with Frankenstein. What we say is in America is Frankenstein with Frankenstein. This is the way in which now we can have a different story. And she tells this story in 1818. And from there, we see an explosion related of going for more of the sky, the space, the final frontier. I don't know, did you guys see my shirt? It's Doctor Who is a police box, the TARDIS, so that's also honoring that, right? Thank you. Yeah, so we have H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, James Loudon. I mean, Jane, I'm mentioning Jane because one thing I didn't know is she created the first mummy story. And you're like, well, that's not science fiction. He was actually, the mummy was awakened by science means, by scientific means. Arthur C. Doyle, Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain. This is where this really starts to explode. And then, of course, we go into the 20th century. And some of my favorite movies, maybe some of yours, are up there. I mean, it's not an exhaustive list, it's a slide. So we can't have everything up there. But it gives you an idea of what we have. And so the dream starts to come true. So one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I mean, sexist as hell, but you get the idea. And then we have the space race that really takes off between the USA and what was known as the Soviet Union. We have the launching of Sputnik and the satellites that roar into the heavens. And from there, we also have this behemoth. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about this because I think it's, I didn't know much about it. Anyone recognize what this is? It's the International Space Station. When I didn't know, it is the most expensive single item ever constructed in human history. It has cost $150 billion. You might start to grasp now where I'm going to go. Okay, now it wasn't just, the bill wasn't just foot by NASA. Russia gave, in terms of its, I guess that would be close to 40 years, 12 billion. The European Union gave 5 billion, Japan gave 5 billion, Canada gave 2 billion. And assuming that, as I'm going to read something here, assuming 20,000 person days of use from 2000 to 2015 by 2 to 2 person 6 crews, it can only fit about maximum 6 people. Each person a day would cost 7.5 million. Less than half the inflation adjusted would be 19.6 million per person per day. Right? So that's the space station. So one thing I'll say, you probably aren't anticipating me, I'm hearing your gasps. We're like, that shit's expensive. Space will not be cheap. But also with satellites. So satellites that are governing our GPS, our Wi-Fi, our TV shows, all manner of things that we have. And then these guys. So that's Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson. Now, I'm going to say something that's going to surprise you. Okay. One thing is now, investments in the space sector total about $264 billion. But the key thing to remember about this is that most of it has gone to the satellites that we seem to love. In terms of when people talk about seeing these launches and like, oh, it's just like dicks in space, right? I mean, people say that, right? They don't put it quite as bluntly. But you know, Tara did warn you. Right? I'm R-rated. So, but here's the thing that's fascinating. With 15 companies involved in making these launches, they spend only 25.9 billion in relation to that 264 billion that goes more for satellites that we like. And what's interesting, and I'm not letting these guys off the hook, even though I do like Richard Branson in the general sense. I mean, I don't know him, he hasn't let me on his island. Is kind of like Bezos, in terms of like how they offset their spending. Bezos alone has given 10 billion in 2020 to fight climate change, and donated 100 million to the World's Central Kitchen. I won't say chicken, but kitchen, to relieve global hunger. So again, I'm not trying to let these guys completely off the hook. You're like, well, what about Elon? Well, Elon has given away 5 million Tesla shares last year. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing, considering what's happening with Tesla, but it's a thing. And I mention this because I'm going to make a different point a little later about what's happening with this. But, you know, I know that some people have a lot of ire, like, well, see, we're having these private individuals shoot people into space. And they'll tell you, like, we're going to have boots on the ground in 2040 and 2030 or whatever. And we're going to go more into that. And then we have the space settlements that we envision on Mars in terms of biodomes and all that. That's happening. Now, as my father might say, is that just smoke going up our asses?
Yeah.
Is it just an illusion? Because we're still talking about Neptune here. So let's get into that. First off, I want to point this out. This is just an artist's rendition of essentially how we need to clean our room. This is an artist's rendition, but it's not terribly inaccurate because of known and tracked space junk, 70% is in low Earth orbit, which extends around 1,250 miles or 2,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. So even though this is just an artistic representation, it's not shot in space, it's pretty damn accurate into what we're doing in space. There's more. Here's what's really happening with these billionaires. What's really happening with these billionaires, you'll notice in 1957, the Vanguard rocket was $900,000 per kilogram. And then it goes continuously down to as recent as 2018, it's now $1,500 per kilogram, which means that those billionaires are just waiting out for a sale. It's just a deal. So when we're talking about them shooting off into space and people are getting angry about that, I'm like, they're just getting like rocket fuel and rocketing has become cheaper, but everything else in space is still mad expensive. So that's the thing to keep in perspective. Now, there is this idea that once we get into space, philosophically, we will be able to appreciate more about our planet and Earth. This is actually a Twitter exchange between Scott Kelly, who is an astronaut on the space station, who was expressing in Russian his ire about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so he says here, Dimon, and he's talking about another astronaut who also was on the station, without these flags, because he was angry about celebrating particular flags, celebrated flags being taken down related to the Ukraine and what's happened with Ukraine. So he says, Dimon, without these flags and the foreign currency they bring, your space program wouldn't be worth a damn. Maybe you can find a job at McDonald's if McDonald's still exists in Russia. To which, you know, Dimon Rogozin replies, get off, you moron, in English. So this idea that space makes everyone look at Earth more fondly, more philosophically and broadly is bullshit. It's not going to happen, right? That's not what's happening. So what about the other elements of space? Well, look at the slide title. How should I kill thee? Let me count the ways. So let's talk about what space really entails. And I'm giving you the short list. The short list is that there's no oxygen. I mean, some of it you're going to know, of course, no oxygen, and we still don't understand or know the long-term damage from radiation in space. So for instance, just to bring this home, because I know you can read the slide, like we have a magnetosphere and an atmosphere on Earth that protects us from the hot ions of the sun. But in terms of what we don't know, largely the people who have been in space, you can guess gender-wise who they are, men. So we have no idea really what happens with women. None, in terms of the ratio. If the pressure of space's vacuum doesn't get you, then the lack of proper care with your spacesuit could. There haven't been too many accidents, but that doesn't keep you completely safe. You lose 1% of your bone mass every month. And actually to be in space, to be an astronaut, you actually have to work out about 2 to 3 hours a day just to be able to keep your muscle and bone mass. Like literally, they have to do that regimen or it will be very hard for them to come back to Earth. Nobody has been to space longer than 437 days in a row. That's like not even fully 1 1/4 year. And so far, we've only had more of the physically fit in space, so we don't know how that might affect people who have diabetes or any other conditions. And then if I want to read this because I think it's interesting. So right now, kind of going ahead, and I'll go more in detail about this, it's mainly the moon and Mars that we're thinking about where we might be able to settle in our solar system. And Kelly and Zach Weinersmith, they've written a very interesting and good book on Mars, and it's called A City on Mars, and it's actually on space settlement. And this is what they have to say. The moon isn't just a sort of gray Sahara without air. Its surface is made of jagged, electrically microscopic glass and stone, which cleans the pressure suits and landing vehicles. The other thing, it can cut them open. Nor is Mars just an off-world death valley. Its soil is laden with toxic chemicals, and its thin carbon atmosphere whips up worldwide dust storms that blocks out the sun for weeks at a time. And those are the good places to land. Well, you might say, well, what about Venus, Sam, and Mercury, or the moon, or Jupiter, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn? Okay, let's talk about them. Venus is probably closest to what we can know as hell. With its heat, ocean bottom pressure, and clouds laced with sulfuric acid. Mercury is even hotter since it's closer to the sun, and at its equator, it has a balmy temperature of 600 degrees Celsius. For my Americans, it's 112 Fahrenheit. Then there's less chance for seeing sun on the farther planets and their moons, like Jupiter and Saturn, that may have warm subsurface oceans, but they're covered by miles and miles of ice that we would have the technology, or have to have the technology, to be able to dig through. So yeah, I don't think those planets are really going to help. And here's the big thing. We are trading down. Look at that picture of, and it's a real picture, of our moon in front of our planet. Isn't that beautiful? And how many of you saw that solar eclipse, right? Okay, we didn't all see it in full, but we had that solar eclipse. This is what we have on Earth. It's beautiful. This is what you have on Mars. This is an eclipse on Mars. And what that looks like, right, is like, I don't know, someone's head passing in front of a theater, excuse me. Or some snot or something on a microscope lens or something. Or gummy eyeball, right, that you have on Halloween. Thanks, Rumi. And then the other thing to know about it, so Phobos completes its orbit in 7 hours and 39 minutes, which means it makes 3 laps around the moon, all right, in terms of its cycle. Meaning, like, you'll have, like, whatever this is, like a new moon, right, 3 times a day. Now, if there is this correlation with periods, right, and the moon, imagine. Oh, I'm having my period again. Oh, here it comes again. All in one day. So, and then, like, you know, are you gonna really come out your biodome or being like, you know, whatever, and just looking and be like, oh, we gotta see the eclipse. Okay, there it goes. Now, there are some other changes that we'll notice. So Venus and Mercury, Venus is on our left and Mercury is on our right, we'll have fewer retrogrades for Mercury and Venus. So we won't have that every 3 months in terms of Mercury, and then every 18 months. But then we'll have to deal with something new that we've never had to deal with. Earth is retrograde. I don't know how that, you know, like, you know, stay away from me, don't touch me. Where's the food? What does that look like when we start having Earth retrograde? And then we have the Aurora Borealis here on Earth, and I saw some delightful pictures of them here, and I didn't realize that you guys got to see it up here in Seattle, right? And enjoy the wonders of Aurora Borealis, you know, in terms of the colors. Like, I know that some people saw more reddish where I am. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so around in New Mexico, they saw more reds and some greens. This is it on Mars. Okay, and it's worse than this because a couple things to know about this is that you're seeing a representation, but it's ultraviolet light that really happens during the day. Okay, and you really can't even see it along the human spectrum. So this is largely how it might look. And unlike going toward the northern extremes here on our planet, their auroras on Mars can happen anywhere on the planet. So that isn't sexy. Well, let's go on. On Earth, we have melanin that also protects us from our magnetosphere and atmosphere. However light or however dark you are, you still have some measure of melanin. It won't do shit for you on Mars. Okay. You'll actually have to, you would start to develop carotenoids, you know, that we see in carrots and oranges, and it would make your skin orange. So this makes me think this man has like a jump on it. I mean, it's interesting, and I'll come back and say more about this. I mean, he is Mars rising. Here's the funny thing. On Mars, he ends up in Aries with his Mercury and his Venus in Aries. And his Deimos is in Capricorn, and Uranus is Pluto, his not his Pluto, but his Phobos is in Gemini. So, you know, we have that. But here's the other thing to know about it. So remember what I said, that you would lose 1% of bone mass each month, right? So on Mars, because it has 1/3 the gravity that we have on our planet, which with each successive generation, if we could get to the point that we have generations on Mars, not only would the kids be orange, right? I'm not joking. They would, I guess orange is the new black, really. So, not only would they be orange, but they would lose some measure of their bone density if they came, you know, as they come back to Earth. And so they would be really brittle. You know, you go to touch them, welcome to Earth. Oh, I cracked your spine, right? And that would be really that serious. And the other thing is that we have diseases and all kinds of pathogens that they wouldn't be exposed to because they have to be in a sterile environment on Mars. So they wouldn't really be able to readily come home. Yeah, he's an orange man. So let's get to Pluto, like taking this a little more toward home. So one of the things that Greer talks about, and first I'll say a little bit about what Pluto represents. I mean, first we have the discovery of Pluto in 1930, and then the naming of Pluto by an English girl, 11-year-old Venetia Burney, who decides that it would be fitting to name it after the Roman god of the underworld. And it's interesting because the person who had sponsored looking for Pluto and the creator of the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Percival Lowell, is the first 2 letters of the word Pluto. So they thought it was fitting. And also at that time, you know, it also inspired Mickey's dog, Pluto. And then there was something else that was popular at the time called Pluto water, which was about expelling. It's a laxative. So I was trying to clean it up, but you know, this makes you. And some astrologers think that's where some of the significations for Pluto really came from. I don't know if I can disagree with that. You know, I wasn't around then, but that's interesting. But Pluto becomes symbolic of cracking codes, you know, in terms of what happens if we're going along with Greer's idea in terms of DNA, and then also in terms of the atom structure and the structure of the atom, then the breaking up of, you know, traditional ideas of art, and then the human psyche that we have with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And then we also have the breaking up of the order of things related to capitalism and challenges from communism and Marxist theory. So Richard Tarnas has one particular general view most of us take with Pluto, And he says, an archetypal principle whose character is Dionysian, elemental, instinctual, powerfully compelling, extreme in its intensity, arising from the depths, both libidinal and destructive, overwhelming and transformative, ever evolving. Greer has a different view, and his core theme of the Plutonian era, as he's deeming it, is the rejection of cosmos. And he defines cosmos as it was defined historically as an ordered beauty of the heavens. And humanity has descended into shattering of this unity with degenerate, his words, degenerate emphasis on individuality, nuclear fission, space travel, communism, feminism, psychoanalysis, modern art, and culture. So his idea is that Pluto, and then subsequently its demotion, is kind of dealing with how we broke open a certain order. Now, he thinks this demotion will challenge many of these ideas that basically he says nuclear fission is more of a pipe dream in terms of what it's yielded in terms of our history, and even more so with nuclear fusion. And then his critiques of communism, definitely critiques of feminism. He was smart enough to avoid issues related to race. I was waiting for that. I was like, okay, let's go. Come on. But I think it's in there. I think he was just smart to avoid it. But brings up a question. Are we really talking about a demotion or getting clarity? Is it really a shattered cosmos or just a broken, lopsided vision of the cosmos? Are we really just talking about breaking open ideas that we deem beautiful and classical because they come from an imperial culture or set of imperial cultures? And I think, thank you. Yeah, but I think that's the recognition. And I think it's going to be important for us to think about that rather than thinking cosmos is just something that is perpetually true for all cultures. So in other words, who we become in outer space may be more determined by who we are and who we become down here. And to echo what Frank Clifford said yesterday from Anais Nin, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. So that brings up a question. What would an astrology on other worlds entail, considering how it's evolved on ours? So now we go to So Below. So another book in my research for this project and this talk that I would highly recommend is Bruce Schofield's book, The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems. I also talked with Dr. Natalie Dinsdale, who's an evolutionary psychologist from Canada, in a private interview. And they both said something very interesting, that the basis of our astrology, starting with the cycles of the sun and the moon, have always been part of our evolution and most of the species on this planet, right? So the astrology that we have is part of an endemic self-organizing system already within us, right, in terms of how we understand things. So between the diurnal circadian rhythms related to the moon and the photoperiodism of the sun, which we call the seasons. And scientists are now discovering that there is a correlation between certain propensities, quote unquote, disorders that do align with physiological and psychological states and seasons. Schofield also documents that there is some evidence of this in natural astrology as seen in weather and geological patterns around the globe, meaning that there is a correlation when Saturn's at particular configurations and also has particular squares or connections with planets, that it actually does get colder. So there's a way in which we understand astrology that may even have not just scientific basis, but a natural basis related to our evolution. So in other words, perhaps astrology isn't just wholly divination, but a self-organizing cosmobiological system. The other contributing factor is that we've had thousands of years of observation, from the Mul Alpin of Babylon to Hesiod's works and days, and the observations of indigenous astronomers worldwide who saw that it's crucial to acknowledge that our understanding of astrology evolved from a deep-seated curiosity. And so these early astronomers believed that events had significance and meaning, that there was a reason why we were seeing these particular things. On other worlds, will we strive to terraform the planet, meaning that to try to make it more like Earth and to colonize it rather than be in harmony with it as our ancestors sought to do? Are we just going to try to conquer it? We have developed more instruments to observe, whether we're talking about Mars or putative exoplanets, but are we seeing as much as our ancestors? Because to observe is not necessarily to see. So the other thing that has been part of our astrology, and I think this is actually very critical, are the stories and myths that we have. Compared to the planets in our immediate solar system, subjectively as a species, basically, we've had it good on Earth, right? We've actually had it very good. And if we become or we go on tougher worlds, are we going to become more severe? Will that be reflected in our stories and how we talk about ourselves? You know, it's interesting. I don't know if any of you have seen or read Dune, but if you know about the Harkonnens, right? And you think, and you look at their planet, right? Like, oh, that's why those bitches are like that. And you see, and you have to think, will we become like that? Will we lose, like being on Mars, on a red planet, and dealing with things being in desolation? Will we become more desolate? Are we prepared for that? Our myths and stories have reflected this beauty. As my friend and dearly departed colleague Shelley Ackerman would say, astrology is the marriage between math and myth. So are we prepared to keep the myth, or are we just going to emphasize the math? Many of our stories are actually what I would call stories. Oh, was that corny or something? Okay. Dwayne Hammacher observes in The First Astronomers how indigenous elders read the stars. Stories are layers of knowledge based on careful observation of these stars. And we talk about it all the time with our Greek and Roman myths, but there's scores of indigenous, if not thousands of indigenous stories that we don't know, and that have also told the story of the stars. Are we still going to be tapped into those stories, or are we just going to be doing survival reports? Because that's what's made us human and kept us human. In other words, are we grown enough to respect our past enough to be good caretakers of our future? My people, for instance, African Americans during enslavement would use the stars as guides toward freedom. Are we going to keep that same kind of sensibility? I mean, not the enslavement part, but I mean more so the idea of looking for freedom. Another good book I would recommend is Conversing with the Planets by Anthony Aveni. And I want to read this because I think it's a fascinating take to understand the discrepancies that we're facing. Unlike our ancient counterpart, the modern Venus is no lady. Instead, she moves about a vaster sky, an inanimate object to be entered and dissected with Venera and Magellan spacecraft. Space-age Venus, probed from afar and experienced indirectly through television imagery, emerges as a world like our own, with continents and an atmosphere, yet in an unimaginably hostile place, a fiery hell, pelted by acid rain. Modern Mars is no longer her celestial lover, but instead a dead world of desiccated crater-pocked plains, ancient canyons, and empty valleys. If we consider these hollow reports a kind of dialogue with the planet, it is a far cry from the one in which people gazed at Mars and Venus and spoke their names to invoke their powers. Are we going to keep that? So, in conclusion, an interstellar civilization, much less an interstellar astrology, is likely farther off than we surmise. And that may be a good thing. Are we prepared to be on our best behavior off-world if we can't do it on this world? An interstellar astrology on other worlds would mean a willingness to greet a new world with different stars and planets anew. Yet even more, we shouldn't expect our homes to replace our old one. Remember, the last time we dubbed places the New World, folks got exterminated, massive amounts of people, and brought much of the old world problems with massive complications in tow. So when we talk about the prospect of interstellar astrology, leaving our big blue marble, there's a couple of things I want to leave you with, because well, it sounds like, Sam, you don't have a lot of faith that we'll get out there. I actually still believe in our ability to get out there, no matter how long it takes to do it right, for one reason only. I believe in us. We're some smart primates and monkeys and apes, right? I'll say apes, we're not monkeys. We must not let our humanism blind us to our divinity, our light. And we must not let our disenchantment with the cosmos continue to disenfranchise ourselves. Whether on this world or any other we come to visit or inhabit, our planet is so special. That's what I hope I'm leaving you with. That this big blue marble is a wonder. We actually must be willing to greet each world just as special. I don't know if we're willing to do that, or if we're able to do that. We must be cautious not to focus on mere details and correct analyses. This planet has loved us into being, and I believe we must be representatives of that love as we venture into space. A wise woman once said to me, and I think about this a lot, even with social media, people want to be right more than they want to be loved. And that wasn't always true in our history. I think there were times when we wanted to love and be loved and to share love. And I think we need to get back to that. So that's, to quote Rumi, love is the astrolabe of God's mysteries. A lover may be drawn to this love or that love, but finally he or she is drawn to the sovereign of love. So you can call this sovereign whatever you want, the cosmos, God, karma, Shiva, Allah, Jesus, Atman. But one thing we can't deny is that this is home, and we have to remember to take our home and our love with us as we journey to the great beyond. Thank you.